Good morning. My name is Brock Kidd, and on behalf of Pinnacle Financial Partners, we want to welcome you to this very special Pinnacle Forum. Knowing our brilliant guest, we're in for a fascinating and timely discussion. We're going to have plenty of time for questions when Jon's finished speaking, so be prepared to come up and speak in one of the mics at the front of the room at that time. Jon Meacham is a Tennessee native, having attended the Macaulay School, then Sewanee, where he graduated summa cum laude and salutatorian. Jon's newest work, And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle, has critics raving. The Washington Post called it a guiding light for our times. Jon gave me the privilege of reading it before it hit the shelves, and I think you'll agree it's an important reminder of why our morals and strong convictions of what is right are important in our beloved country today. Jon's other recent works include The Hope of Glory, Reflections on the Last Words of Jesus from the Cross, and His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. Both were on the New York Times bestseller list. In that same year, HBO aired a documentary on the soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. All of this followed other monumental biographies, including Destiny and Power, his celebrated work about George H.W. Bush. In 2009, Jon was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his book, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. He also achieved international recognition for his works on Thomas Jefferson, his intriguing Franklin and Winston about Franklin and Winston about Roosevelt and Churchill, and American Gospel. Along the way, Jon was honored by Vanderbilt University with an endowed chair. He's also been appointed the first canon historian of Washington National Cathedral, which is the seat of the Episcopal Church. Through his works, Jon has become one of America's most beloved historians. He delivered the eulogy for First Lady Barbara Bush, and several months later, Jon was the anchor eulogist for his dear friend, the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. To those who know him, Jon is as good of a man and father as he is a gifted mind. And once again, we're proud that Jon and his family call Nashville home, and here at Pinnacle, we're proud to call him a friend. Please welcome Jon Meacham.
I don't think that was nice enough. Oh, am I on? So, a couple of fact checks. First of all, how's the account today? Good, because you're here talking about me. I'd rather have you working. I think I speak for everyone. No, Brock is a dear, dear friend, and I was sitting there thinking, yes, I am all those things, and maybe he's just not being nice enough. And my mind went back to a moment, it was now 12, 14 years ago, on the Washington Mall. I was at the National Book Festival on the way to give my talk at that point about our fellow Tennessean, Andrew Jackson. And a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough, or ever, actually. And she said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I said, "Well, yes, existentially speaking, that's hard to argue with." And usually I can't use existential as an adverb, so thank you. She said, I love your books. They've meant so much to me. Will you wait right here? I'm going to go buy your new book and have you sign it. And I said, yes, ma'am. And I stood there, and I'll confess, I was thinking this is the way the world is supposed to work, right? Women run up to you. They buy your book. It was a twofer. Hand to God, she brought back John Grisham's latest novel. So, totally true story. So whenever I think I'm the most important anything, I remind myself that somewhere in America there's a woman with a forged copy of The Runaway Jury, right? Because you have to sign it, so I signed it. That's a true story. The second part is also true, and that gets us to a very important story about Brock. I was at that point I was working on the book about President Bush. It took me 17 years. The book was supposed to be posthumous, but the son of a bitch wouldn't die. And so I bring it up, he'd say, not gonna do it. The key to doing the old man's voice, as Dana Carvey once said, was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. It's a perfect description of what it was. But I was on my way to Maine to see the Bushes, and it was very unusual. It was just the three of us at lunch that day, which almost never happened. Bush World was like a WASP Epcot, right? the Oak Ridge Boys would be in the kitchen, Gorbachev would be on the tennis court, Billy Graham would be on the putting green. It was a very strange world. But it was just us. And I told the story about being mistaken for Grisham. And I will confess to you that it was an entirely transparent attempt to get either the former president or the former first lady to say, oh, you're so much more important than John Grisham, right? So I'd cast the fly out on the water, and Barbara Bush looks across the table in that inimitable way of hers and said, well, how do you think poor John Grisham would feel? He's a very handsome man. So it was not a big weekend for me. I'm always delighted to be here. Thank you to Rob and always to Brock. On another occasion when I was with the Bushes, and some of you may have heard me tell this, but you really can't tell it enough. We were there for a golf tournament. I was the celebrity golfer because Reba McEntire had canceled, which is kind of my role in life. And Brock was there, and our friend Mark Banks was there. And we go in to have drinks with the Bushes. And the nice waiter says to the 41st president, what would you like? And the president said, vodka and ice. And Brock says, I'll have what the president's having. Instantly, Barbara Bush said, he's been waiting 50 years to say that sentence. So that tells us exactly everything about everyone. I don't know if you all followed the big news yesterday. I don't know if anybody followed the news at all. We'll talk about that in a second. I think we are here at a particularly intriguing moment in the life of the country. The basic poll numbers about satisfaction with the direction of the country, the sense of what issues matter to people, have been traditionally set against the incumbent powers. That tends to happen. Midterm elections are almost always terrible for an incumbent, partly because the American people, what we tend to do is we tend to elect someone and then immediately decide we don't like them. We almost always have buyer's remorse. This has been true really throughout American history. Abraham Lincoln lost functional control of the United States House of Representatives in the middle of the Civil War. He lost the 1862 midterm elections and the governorships of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So there's a certain pattern here. Starting in 1946, just to use the basic, more modern era, Harry Truman won World War II and then lost the Congress for the first time since 1932. Lost 55 seats in the House and 12 seats in the Senate. 1966, Lyndon Johnson, who had just won the largest landslide in American history in 1964, loses 62 seats in the House of Representatives, and Ronald Reagan becomes the governor of California. So the backlash was already to the Great Society was already in place. Same thing happened to President Reagan in 1982. It happened, as we all know, to President Clinton in 1994. It happened to President Bush the second in 2006. It happened to President Obama in 2010. It happened in 2018. It didn't happen yesterday. And we can talk about why that is. What's most important, I think, and whatever value I can add to these conversations, is what are the habits of heart and mind that create eras of public life that are marked by prosperity, security, opportunity, and a genuine realization of the country's mission statement, right? The mission statement of the country is the Declaration of Independence. The user's guide is the Constitution. It's the declaration that imbues everything we do with a particular mission. And that mission is to realize the reality of a nation that was founded not on geography, not on ethnicity, not on religion, but on an idea of equality, that we were all born with the capacity to determine our own destinies. There is nothing partisan about that. That is the American project. And sometimes we do well in its pursuit, and sometimes we do poorly. And the nature of history, like the nature of our lives, is defined by the degree to which we close the gap between the ideal and the real. I firmly believe, this has nothing to do with party, I firmly believe that the country has a soul. Soul in Hebrew and in Greek means breath or life. When God breathed life into man in Genesis 1, that word could be translated as soul. When Jesus said, "Greater love hath no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends," life could be translated as soul. It's what separates us from inanimate objects. And I don't want to drag you all into my personal drama, but I happen to know that my soul is in constant flux between my better angels and my worst instincts. I know that I basically understand what the right thing to do is most of the time, and I don't always do it. And I write books about sinners, which is good, because if you only wrote them about saints, there'd be fewer of them. More trees would survive, which I guess that's one good thing. But I don't see, therefore, if that resonates at all with you, that you know what's right, you kind of want to do it, but you don't quite get there all the time, why would the country be any different? Because we're a democracy. And we are therefore, the public life of the country is the fullest manifestation of all of our habits of heart and mind. And so sometimes we get it right, a lot of times we get it wrong, and yet we endure. And that's the key part of the American experience. And yet we endure. And we only endure if we remember why we're doing it at all. And the why is the Declaration of Independence. It is, in fact, the notion, the reality, that we're created equal, we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Most important sentence ever originally rendered in English. A sentence that's changed more lives around the world than any other. Now, that's a hyperbolic claim, I understand that. To say something's the most important sentence in the English language. It reminds me of the old story about the Texas school board candidate who was against teaching Spanish in the public schools and said on the stump one day, "If English was good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for Texas." So, when George Bush was governor of Texas, I told him that story. He went, said, "That's pretty funny, asshole." So, it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship. But I mean it. It has. The men who hit the beaches of Normandy were not doing it for conquest. They were doing it to liberate. The people who went across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965 weren't doing it for conquest. They were doing it for liberation. What we do every day needs to be seen in that light and weighed in those scales. Does this advance the mission of the country, or does it not? And then when we do the thing that doesn't, you don't jump off the bridge. You just rededicate yourselves, pull up your socks, and try to do it again. That's the nature of history. That's the nature of the country. It's the nature of politics. And when we begin to treat politics as the all-consuming drama, as an occasion for total war, every minute of every day, every tweet, every cable chyron, every hour, then politics becomes almost idolatrous because it becomes everything when in fact politics is not supposed to be the end of our lives, but the means. And when it becomes the end, it becomes distorting. And we have lived through an era of great distortion in the country, where our public life is not seen as a realm in which we can resolve our differences, find solutions to commonly agreed upon problems for a given period of time, and press on. Instead, it's become this circular firing squad. And if it remains that, God help us, because if you put power at the center of your project, if power is what you are seeking at all costs, the cost of the Declaration, the cost of the Constitution, the cost of a common life, then you better hope you're really, really strong. Because every bit of history since the first time we climbed out of the muck is that the strong become the weak, and the weak tend to become the strong. So if you're on top, that feels great for that moment. But you're not always going to be on top. That's the nature of the world. Empires rise and fall. The genius of this country was to moderate this struggle between the strong and the weak. If I recognize your equality, your dignity, then you are more likely to respect mine. That's how America became America. And if I don't, then why the hell should you respect mine? If I see you as the other, as beyond redemption, as an opponent and an enemy, as opposed to a neighbor with whom I disagree. Whenever I use the word neighbor, I am reminded of, I'm going to tell you, there's a quick story about a very small category called great tweets. It's like French military victories in the 20th century. It's a very short book. But about 6 months ago, somebody tweeted out that if Mr. Rogers and Doris Goodwin had a one-night stand, I would have resulted. I thought it was great. Doris was kind of pissed off. So she called, and she said, Doris, Mom, it's okay. And she said, no. Couldn't Mr. Rogers and I have had a wonderful long marriage and you were the fruit of our union? I said, no, sweetheart, he picked you up in the C-SPAN bar. That's the point here. She's still a little grumpy about that. But I mean it. Democracies work if we see each other as neighbors and not as enemies. And Abraham Lincoln, don't take my word for it, take Abraham Lincoln's word for it. So I want to talk about a couple of characteristics that I think are vital for us now. This is not partisan. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I voted for both parties, hope to continue to. I do believe that the country itself thrives when we recognize that the rule of law, the Constitution, the Declaration should take precedence over temporary policy disputes. I think part of the vote yesterday that continues to be counted is about that, is about people they may disagree with the incumbent presidential party's specific policies, but the evidence of the election is that by and large they thought that the rule of law, the Constitution, an ethos of governance is preferable to the alternative. And that's a principled decision. And it's really hard. It's really hard to say, you know what, I may not love this tax rate, I may not love that policy, but I believe that team in this hour is better in the long run for the country. That's really hard to ask people to do. Imagine, you're asking for a very complicated kind of decision. But it appears to be what a lot of folks did. I want to talk about three characteristics. I want to talk about conviction and curiosity, and then the most important thing that makes any of this work, whether it's a business or a country, and that's empathy. Conviction. Abraham Lincoln was not a perfect guy. Somebody asked me the other day, if President Biden could ask Lincoln for advice, what would Lincoln say? And I thought, the only thing I could think of was, don't go to the theater. But anyway, which seems to be kind of rational to me. He was not. W.E.B. Du Bois described him as a big, brave, inconsistent man. He said things that we would find Lincoln said things that we would find reprehensible. And yet, he was a sinner who managed to do one or two hugely important saintly things. And that's the remarkable thing about the country, is that fallen, frail, and fallible people have the capacity to do really important good things. And that's at once thrilling and terrifying for the rest of us, right? It's thrilling because they weren't gods walking around in the past. As my friend David McCullough, whom we just lost, used to say, no one walked around in the past saying, what an interesting world the past is, right? Our past was their present, and our present is going to be somebody else's past. And again, that's thrilling because it means we can shape it, we can mold it, we can change it, we can preserve it, whatever we want to do. But that means that in the fullness of time, other people are going to be looking back and assessing what we did with our own hour upon the stage. And that's terrific. And it's really, really chilling because it means that we are, in fact, responsible. We live in the greatest country in the world, but to whom much is given, much is expected. And we've been given the greatest privilege of all, which is to be a citizen of the United States of America in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the summer of 1945, we became the most powerful nation imaginable because suddenly we had the capacity to end human life. It was a negative exemplum of power, but we used it wisely, and we haven't used it since. We built a middle class. We built a level of prosperity that the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire couldn't even imagine. We are children of that sacrifice. We stand on those shoulders. And what drove it as a moral matter? The conviction that we are all created equal and are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. It took us a long time to realize it. We haven't fully realized it even yet. But the journey is the struggle. Abraham Lincoln did what he did, not because he was a politician. I have lots of friends who, it turns out other people have written about Lincoln. I don't know if y'all knew that. I was misinformed. I thought he was an undercover guy. But he didn't do it simply because it was practical. Because if you do things only as a politician, there's always a reason to do the opposite. Those are all 5149 calls. Lincoln was Lincoln because he believed three things. He believed that slavery must die, the Union must survive, and democracy as a global factor must be preserved. And at three critical moments, he had every reason to do the opposite that would have run against those three goals. And at immense political risk to himself, he nevertheless undertook to do it. The first was he wins the presidency with 39% of the vote, and immediately there's a compromise put on the table. Now we're going to have a little quiz here. Nobody look around. Who here knows about the Crittenden Compromise? Okay. That's what I thought. Maybe you're being shy, but I know, Brock is checking the market, so I know he's not paying attention. The Crittenden Compromise was the kind of thing that somebody like me, if they had had cable news in 1860, would have sat there and said, well, Joe, it really touches a lot of the notes, and it really might be something to look at. It's the kind of thing we would approve of. It was from a senator from Kentucky. The idea was that you would avoid the Civil War by taking the Missouri Compromise line. I know you're having now flashbacks to U.S. history. I'm sorry. It'll be brief. Out to the eastern coast of California, thus opening Arizona, New Mexico to slavery. And then the thought was that South Carolina and the other states would not secede. Charles Francis Adams of Massachusetts, a leading Republican congressman, one of the founders of the Adams dynasty, was for it. 20,000 merchants in New York, folks like you, signed a petition saying this is what we should do. William Seward, the Secretary of State, the most powerful Republican in the country, more powerful than Lincoln, said do it. Lincoln said no. Why? Because he had listened to what the white South was saying. Our heirs in this state and elsewhere were not simply about keeping the institution of slavery where it existed. The goal was to go south. It was called the Golden Circle. Cuba was going to be the center of what was known as the Golden Circle. Havana would be the center of this new slave-based empire. It would include parts of Mexico. It would include the Caribbean, might take Nicaragua. A Nashvilleian named William Walker in 1856 and 57 had led a filibuster. The original meaning of the word, you can dazzle people at Thanksgiving with this. Filibuster it comes from the Spanish word for pirate. So when you filibuster something, you take it over. A filibuster in the middle of the 19th century was a privately funded expedition to take over territory and control it. And so a man, Walker, who was from Nashville, he was known as the gray-eyed man of destiny. He knew branding. It was great. He takes over Nicaragua. And the Spanish Empire had abolished slavery. He reinstitutes slavery in Nicaragua in 1857. It was seen as a scouting mission for what the white South wanted to do. 4 presidential administrations had tried to add Cuba to the United States. Not as some sort of large free state with cigars, though I would be for the second part, but as a new bulwark for slavery that therefore I would submit would clearly have lasted into the 20th century. Lincoln had listened to them. Every once in a while, people just say what they mean. He had paid attention. And he believed, like Churchill in 1940, with Nazi Germany, that appeasement had not worked. That they'd given and given and given. And that at that point, there had to be a line beyond which you would not go. Why did he think that? Because he was anti-slavery. And he believed that the institution had to die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but certainly not into the 20th century. That was a moral conviction. A purely political person would have done the opposite, would have taken the deal. What do we do but make deals in the United States? We celebrate it. How many times people said, oh, I wish we could compromise more. That's always great if it makes sense, but there are some issues on which compromise is wrong. Slavery was one. World War II was another. I would argue that Soviet communism was one. Civil rights. A lot of issues, compromise is fine. There are some issues on which it is wrong because it runs against that fundamental insight, which is that we are driven by the Declaration of Independence. And so Lincoln said no. I mentioned Churchill, so I have to tell you quickly, the only thing you'll remember, which has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but it's a great story. Churchill was in the men's room of the House of Commons one day at the Long Trough, and Clement Attlee, the Labourite socialist prime minister, comes in, sort of the Bernie Sanders of England, comes in and stands next to him, and Churchill steps over. And Attlee says, "Are you feeling standoffish today, Winston?" And Churchill said, "No, it's just that every time you see something big, you want to nationalize it." So there's really no significance to that, but it is one of the great stories. Brock is now rethinking his invitation. Fort Sumter, he comes to power, and Seward again, Winfield Scott, they don't want to go to war over a fort in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln said no. It's a federal fort. Appeasement has not worked. We must do it. And in 1864, and in the re-election, in the middle of August, in the home stretch of the presidential campaign of 1864, Lincoln has insisted that emancipation cannot be negotiable. That there can be peace talks with the Confederacy, but not if the possibility of re-enslavement is on the table. And to tell you how long ago this was, the editor of the New York Times was the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Right? We're talking about Thermopylae. He comes to Washington and he tells Lincoln, if you do not compromise on emancipation, you will lose re-election. Lincoln says no. He says, men act on incentive. I have asked black men to take up arms in defense of this union, and I cannot therefore have them face the prospect of being re-enslaved. And he sits down and he writes a note that says, it now appears in recent days that this administration will not be returned to power, and if so, I will be required by the Constitution to so cooperate with the president-elect as to attempt to save the Union between the election and the inauguration. He pledged to follow the results no matter what. Think about that for a second. Think about the fact that we had a presidential election in the middle of a civil war that would kill 750,000 people. We used to think it was 600,000. Demographers now believe it was 750. It never occurred to Lincoln not to have the election, because when he was asked about it, he said, how can we be fighting to defend a constitution and then not hold a constitutionally prescribed election? It would undercut the central point. Conviction mattered. It mattered to him. It has to matter to us. And it kind of doesn't matter what it is. For him, it was anti-slavery and pro-union. I believe that I'm not talking about a conviction about a policy. I'm talking about a conviction that, in fact, this country, the soul of this country, will thrive if we are committed to an idea that we recognize each other's basic humanity. It's not a tough ask, except that it kind of is. I believe that democracy is fundamentally counterintuitive. We are wired to want to take as opposed to give. It's fundamental. I know there's a counter case, but fundamentally, we would like to have everything we can, and then if we feel comfortable enough, maybe we then extend a hand to others. Democracy insists that we give as well as take. And it's really, really hard. And we've seen that anew about how hard that is. And so it shouldn't surprise anyone that it's really, really difficult to do. But it requires constant vigilance, and it's worth the fight. The second thing that we need to be is curious. We have to be more, I believe, interested, not just in what everybody thinks, but what are the fundamental forces that are unfolding, that are shaping the markets, the world, the country. And I would submit that the United States of America itself is a product of a sensibility of curiosity. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that sentence that was the most important ever originally rendered in English, he was doing so not simply because he was a bright young politician of Virginia, though he was, but because he had been in conversation with what had been unfolding in the Western world over the previous 3 or 4 centuries. So what was that? It was Gutenberg. It was the introduction of type, which democratized information. It was the Protestant Reformations, the translation of sacred scripture into the vernacular, the scientific revolution, the European Enlightenment, an entire reorientation of the world, if you think about it, from being seen as vertical, where popes and princes and prelates and kings were given authority over all of us by either an accident of birth in the case of a monarch or the incident of election in the case of a pope, to a more horizontal understanding that we were born with the capacity to determine our own destinies, to pursue our own prosperity, to build our own lives. And that shift, I'd submit, is the most important shift in human affairs since the Passion of Jesus of Nazareth, which determines how we tell time. That shift. And the American Revolution was the fullest political manifestation of that shift. And it was because Jefferson understood the unfolding nature and changing nature of reality. The last is empathy. And if we don't put ourselves in each other's shoes, we don't make it. I want to tell you a quick story, and then we'll hear whatever's on your minds about President Bush again, the senior President Bush. This is a story about someone you all have never heard of, named Bennett McNichol. Bennett McNichol, and this is key to the story, was a fairly rotund lad. He had not paid attention to Mrs. Obama's school lunch program. He was a big guy. He was a classmate of George Herbert Walker Bush's at Greenwich Country Day School in the 1930s. And in the 8th grade, right before the senior President Bush went off to boarding school, there was an annual obstacle course race. And Bush always won the race. And so in his last year, the faculty came to him and said, "Would you let everybody have a head start?" And Bush said, "Okay." Bennett McNichol was part of the group. They go off, Bush goes off. He's going through a series of barrels on the ground, and he pops out, and Bush looks to his right, and Bennett McNichol is stuck in a barrel. Right? So, moment of maximum adolescent humiliation. Right? You're the fat kid, you're stuck in a barrel, the future commander-in-chief is looming over you. Not a good moment on the playground. What does Bush do? He reaches down, he pulls him out. He says, "Come on, Bennett, we'll finish this together." Biggest moment of Bennett McNichol's life, because he tied George Bush in the annual obstacle course race. Sweet schoolboy story, right? The kind of thing a political family would tell to show what a great man their principal is. I didn't hear it from a Bush. I heard it from a McNichol, because the guy told the story for 70 years. No one had ever been so nice to him. And so I took the story to the president. And I said, "Mr. President," we're down in Houston. I said, "Mr. President, I just heard this story about Bennett McNichol." And the first thing the old man said was, "Bennett, he loved lunch." I said, No. Really not the point, sir. He says, "He's still big?" I said, "Sir, not the point." I said, "Sir, why did you pull him out of the barrel?" And President Bush looked at me really as if I were crazy. And he said, "Well, I'd never been stuck in a barrel, but if I had been, I'd want somebody to pull me out." You idiot, Think about what he did not say. He did not say, "I pulled him out of the barrel because my mother taught me that." He didn't say, "I pulled him out of the barrel because that's what the Bible says." He didn't say, "I pulled him out of the barrel because that's what good people do." No. He pulled him out of the barrel because he lent a hand thinking that someday he might need one. He helped so that he might be helped. It was a covenant. And that covenant is our democracy. So let's pull each other out of as many barrels as we can. Thank you. Thank you. If you have any questions about fee structure, interest rates.
Thank you, John. As
Reverend,
always.
Reverend.
Good to be here, even though you're an Episcopalian. That's okay, right?
Question. There are only six of us left, Reverend. Don't be.
After, I guess last night, yesterday, and then they're still counting the votes, would you make any kind of projection over the next 2 years what it looks like for each party, starting with the Democrats? Do you think Joe Biden will run again? And then with the Republicans?
A lot depends on votes still being counted. obviously. The Senate's still uncertain. The margin in the House is still uncertain. I think it would be very unlikely for the Democrats to maintain control of the House. But it's a narrow thing, and the size of the margin will reflect what they can and can't do. Americans like divided government, or at least we do it so much that I hope that we like it. It means that everybody's a check on everybody else. I'm not a partisan, right? I don't have a partisan brain. And so my son, who's very data-driven, thinks I'm sort of amoral, I think, because my basic view is I want there to be a constitutional structure defined by certain norms and institutions in which we can resolve these problems peaceably. And it's very hard for me to imagine a particular policy on which I would throw myself in front of a train. So take this for what that's worth. I'm an institutionalist, which is easy for me to be, right? I'm a boringly heterosexual white Southern male Episcopalian. Things work out for me in this country. And so I think that the message out of last night, it seems to me, one man's opinion, is that extremism doesn't work. It's that people who explicitly denied the results of the 2020 election, almost all of them lost in the governor's races. In the key Secretary of State races, they lost. And that's really good news for democracy. And I would say that if a Republican had won in 2020 and you had the other party saying what that party's been saying. So that's the good news. I think that democratic norms, lowercase d, prevailed yesterday. But that was yesterday. And it's going to be continue to be difficult. I don't know what President Biden's going to do. He continues to say that he intends to run, and I take him at his word. Joe Biden has been left for dead politically for 40 years. Starting in '88, he's had 2 aneurysms. He's lost his family, the daughter and the wife in 1972, and then Beau. And as he says, as a good Irish Catholic, he's a great respecter of fate. And history has put him in this remarkable place at this remarkable hour. And you can disagree with him on policy all you want. There are things I don't like about the policy. But I don't doubt his fundamental character and his fundamental devotion to the rule of law and the good of the republic.
Hi, how you doing? I'm Fabian Bedne, and I have a question about immigration in the historical context.
Yeah.
This country was founded on the idea of no taxation without representation, and yet only recently our bureaucracy created a system where immigrants have to wait many, many years to be able to have access to have representation. And I was just curious if you can give us some historic background on how would have Lincoln or people before the bureaucracy created this huge delay in becoming a citizen, how would they have thought about it?
That's a great question. Immigration has been a divisive issue from the beginning, which is wonderfully ironic since we were all immigrants. But we started fighting about immigration in the 1790s. John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act enabled him to deport particular foreigners, foreign-born nationals, that he believed to be disruptive to the Republic. The Sedition Act which every president since then has wanted to bring back, enabled him to lock up any journalist he didn't like, which they all love the idea of. We had an entire party in the 1840s and 1850s based on anti-immigrant sentiment that was seen as an economic challenge and a cultural disruption, a disruptive cultural force in the country. And most relevant for us, I think, 100 years ago, and this is worth considering if you're feeling despairing or overly hopeful, I'm a good person to have around because I can mess up any of that. 100 years ago, so that would be 1922, right? All right, in 1922, 7 years ago, in 1915, the second Ku Klux Klan would have been refounded at Stone Mountain, Georgia. 2, 3, 4 million people joined the Klan 100 years ago. There were probably 10 senators, probably 30 members of the House, and 5 governors who were members of the KKK 100 years ago. And I used to think, before middle age set in, that 100 years ago was a long time. Now it feels more and more intimate. 5 governors, as I said, governors of Texas and Georgia, which given American history is not stunning, I guess, but Indiana, Colorado, and Oregon had members of the KKK as governors 100 years ago. The 1924 Democratic National Convention went to 103 ballots because there were 347 Klan delegates at Madison Square Garden who would not vote for Al Smith to be the governor of New York because he was an Irish Catholic. And Catholicism was seen as the Sharia law of the era. The governor of Georgia, who was the Klan member, gave a speech in Kansas City in which he said we needed to build a wall as high as heaven to keep immigrants out. And so the second Klan was largely about both anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, and racism. That was 100 years ago. And you had organized labor was against Chinese immigrants in the West because it was an economic threat. Senators on the floor talked about how there could be a yellow empire from California to the Rockies if we didn't control it. So anti-immigrant sentiment ebbs and flows in the American experience. The taxation without representation part is, I think, an element of an entire, if you will, matrix of considerations that is particularly new at the moment. And I'll submit this to you. This too, you could, if things at Thanksgiving are really moving slowly. We're debating in this country whether we were founded in 1619, right? You've heard all that. And so there's the 1619 crowd that Jamestown was the founding, enslavement. Then there's the 1776 caucus that says, no, it was all in Philadelphia in 1776. Here's what I think, for what it's worth. I think we were basically founded for our purposes, as we try to understand where we are, in 1965. The first integrated electorate in the United States of America was in 1968. In 1965, President Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which lifted the 1920s quotas, which grew out of the era I was just describing, the Klan era, which limited Southern European and other nations' immigration. That was what the Roosevelt administration pointed to when they decided not to take in refugees from Nazi Germany. That was lifted only in 1965. And so the immigration picture changes flowing out of that. Flowing out of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that creates the country we're in. The 1968 presidential election, President Nixon wins less than a percentage point over Vice President Humphrey, but George Wallace of Alabama, running then on an explicitly segregationist platform, carried 13.5% of the vote and 5 states in the Electoral College 50 years ago. And so this step forward, step back, this is just a matter of history. It's a perennial tension that we have to confront.
Good afternoon, John. Tim Moorhead, Go Big Blue. Just wanted to ask you about, you said in your first response that you're an institutionalist, not institutionalized.
It's a close call.
Yeah. As an institutionalist, it seems to me that part of the path we've been on is fundamental erosion in the American belief in those institutions which guide us. So what are some of the factors that you think have driven that conviction or lack of conviction in our institutions? And more importantly, how do we pull ourselves out of that barrel?
Oh, very nice. Nice touch. Somebody listened, Rob. Gold star. It won't affect your rates with Brock, trust me. So I have a theory. It won't surprise you. My theory is that, well, look at this holistically. In 1964, 77% of Americans told Gallup that they trusted the federal government to do the right thing some or most of the time. That number is about 12% now. Okay, so that's a 60, numbers are not my strength. That's a big fall. The Commerce Department says that for a family of 4 to lead what we would think of as a post-World War II middle-class life, grown-ups all have a car, you save a little money, you go on vacation, huge part of middle-class signifier, requires about $130,000 a year. Household income for a family of 4 is about $70,000. So you have a gap there of $60,000. You have a fall of about 60 points almost in trust in government. And so all of this unfolds at an hour when we are on our way within a couple of decades to being a non-majority white country for the first time. It unfolds when so many of our businesses, so much of our livelihood is tied up with faraway places. Globalization and its discontents are a huge part of how we are reacting politically. And the institutions that I treasure, and I mean, look at me, I look like Fred McMurray and my 3 sons. I mean, I'm not exactly a radical. The institutions that I believe in have, in the view of many people, not proven commensurate to those challenges. They are 18th century institutions. The Constitution is an 18th century document, but to go back to what we were talking about, so is the Declaration of Independence, and it is as vital and as real and as tactile as ever. And so simply the age of an institution is not dispositive. It's the capacity of leaders and of the led to make those institutions deliver just enough results that just enough people believe the experiment's worth defending. To me, that's the threshold question for any institution, right? It's true for financial institutions. It's true for businesses. You just need to prove to your people, to your customers, your clients, your constituents, that you can deliver more good than bad. And what's the key thing people want to know from you all? They want to know that they are in safe hands. And even if you don't get things exactly right, you never missed the mark because of an actual malice or intentional activity. That should be true in government as well, and statecraft. And I think that a lot of people have a hard time taking that leap of faith. And I understand that. If I were on the other side of the economic equation, I understand why people are frustrated. I understand why people voted the way they did in 2016. Think about the lived experience of a lot of our kids and grandkids. Let's say you were born in 2000 or so. Think about your lifetime. It starts with September 11th. It goes to the wrong intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. It goes into the financial crisis of 08, 09. The presidency of Barack Obama, which was biographically exciting, but ultimately not transformative. The election of 2016, COVID, and insurrection. Why would you think, from your lived experience, if you're 25 years old, that the public sector in the United States of America can deliver those kinds of results? We all grew up, if I may, demographically speaking, most of us, either knowing, living the public sector building something, or living in just a step or two away from that story so that it was real enough. World War II, the fall of the Berlin Wall, civil rights, the prosperity of the post-war era, right? Remarkable achievements, which was both driven by private enterprise and public enterprise, which were the two wings that lifted the country. That story is why I think history is so important. It's why I talk the way I talk. If you can't tell that story to younger people who don't have that trust, then they don't have any reason to believe that this constitutional system is worth defending. And so I think it's incumbent on those of us who believe in it to do all we can to make it work and to tell that story.
The last question.
Last question.
Thanks.
Make it a good one.
John, it's 14 years ago, as I was preparing to move to Tennessee, my business partner sent me a link to your book on Andrew Jackson and recommended that I read it.
And you still came?
And recommended that I read it to understand the history of Tennessee. And as we know, the former president seemed to admire, reportedly, Andrew Jackson, seemed to reverse the trend, movement to remove him from the $20 bill, hung a portrait in the White House. I was wondering if you could just compare and contrast in your mind the two presidents, what their major similarities were and what their major differences were.
Sure. So glad you came. Okay. There are many, many ways to go with this. I'm going to tell you, first of all, the story that is most relevant, which is, I actually answered this question in was it March of 2017 that President Trump, that's right, Howard's here, the president comes to the Hermitage to embrace the Jacksonian legacy. And I was sitting at home, and I decided I should do something, and so I wrote an open letter to the president, which said, welcome, delighted you're embracing history, but if you're going to embrace Andrew Jackson, don't just embrace the extreme parts. And there were plenty of extreme parts of Andrew Jackson to embrace, right? He once said that his only two regrets in public life were that he had not shot Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, and hung John C. Calhoun, his own vice president. Past his prologue. And so I wrote this, and the Tennessean, in a really I sent it to the Tennessean, and a really kind of remarkable thing, it was the entire front page of the paper that day. If there are any young people here, I'll explain what paper is later. I was, one of my favorite pedagogical moments ever at Vanderbilt was one day, about a year ago, a young woman worked for the Vanderbilt student paper. She said, how did you all used to create student newspapers? And I said, well, you would print out the columns and you'd cut them and you'd paste them. And she said, oh my God, that's where cut and paste came from. So anyway, it was a terrible, terrible sign. I said, well, what do you think CC means? And she said, I don't know. I said, well, carbon copy. She said, or against carbon. I said, not that kind of carbon. Anyway, so it was the entire front page of the paper. It had no effect whatever, of course, on President Trump. True story, the next day I'm walking into lunch, and my phone rings, and it was George H.W. Bush. Totally true story. And he had spent a lot of that winter in the hospital down in Houston. And so his staff was printing out stuff for him to read, and they gave him this letter. And so he'd read it, so he called up. He said, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm fine, sir. How are you?" He said, "I'm fine." He said, "I read your letter to Jackson." And I thought, oh, God, the old boy's losing it, right? He thinks I'm writing letters to dead people. And so I said, "Thank you, Mr. President. You know, actually, that was a letter to Trump about Jackson." And without missing a beat, the old man said, "Yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention." And then he hung up. He thought of the joke. He wanted to deliver it. Look, American politics is a mirror of who we are, for good and for ill, in good times and bad times. There's nothing wrong with big personalities. There's nothing wrong with populist movements. There's nothing wrong with passion in the arena. What I believe is absolutely essential, and I believe, by the way, that Andrew Jackson embodied this, is you obey the rules. Democracy, actually this is a good way to stop. Democracy is the score at the top of the ninth, right? Anything can happen. But when the game is done, you don't re-adjudicate it. And Jackson understood that. Jackson lost the presidential election in 1824 after he won the popular vote, and he hashtagged it, he branded it a corrupt bargain, but he came back here and ran again and became this remarkably transformative president. I think Jackson represents the best of us and in many ways the worst of us. But if we don't engage with someone like Andrew Jackson, if we don't engage with Abraham Lincoln, if we don't engage with people in the past, then we limit our own capacity to learn and our own capacities to solve the problems that they solved, because they weren't perfect. And because they were imperfect and did some vital things, then in our imperfection, we can do the same. Thank you.